Okay, let's go ahead and review this cardiovascular lab activity. And we're going to start with this heart model. And one of the first things that's important to do is to orient yourselves. So first off, this is a frontal section of the heart. They've basically taken this heart in a frontal plane, and this is the piece that they removed from it. And so this piece basically fits on top of the heart there. Furthermore, we're looking at an anterior view. We're looking at the front side of the heart. So that represents the front side of the heart in the anatomical position. So let's start down below and orient ourselves and see what we can find. The first thing that I like to do with the heart is, especially with an anterior view, is to look for this vessel right there. What's that vessel? That is the anterior interventricular artery. It's called anterior because it's on the front side of the heart. Interventricular because it separates, or it's found in between the ventricles. And that's a good landmark because then you know on this side of the vessel is the right ventricle, and on this side is the left ventricle. So that's the vessel that separates the right and the left ventricle. Another vessel that I like to look for is this guy right there. And that is the right coronary artery. And that's part of the coronary circulation, the circulation that's providing the muscle of the heart with nutrients and gases and whatnot. But it's also an important landmark because the coronary artery separates the ventricles from the atrium. And it's a little misleading because the right atrium is actually located underneath this structure, which is number 3. And what is that structure number 3? That's the right auricle. And auricles are basically these wrinkly appendages that are attached to the atrium. They're on top of the atrium. And so it's the auricles that you see superficially. But underneath that is the right atrium. Now let's look at the frontal section. This is a good landmark right there. What's that big piece of muscle right down the middle? That's the interventricular septum. It's a divider, a septum, that separates the ventricles. And so again, what ventricle do we find there? That's the right ventricle. And what ventricle is there? That's the left ventricle. Now, what about these questions number 1 and number 2? What chamber are we going to find above the right ventricle? That's the right atrium. And number 2 represents the valve that's separating the right atrium from the right ventricle. And what is that valve? Well, we can call it the right atrioventricular valve, or we can call it the tricuspid valve. So number 1, the right atrium. Number 2, the tricuspid valve. Number 3, the right auricle. And number 4, the right coronary artery. Here we have a larger heart model. And let's zoom in on this picture. This is pretty much an anterior view, but it's a little bit of a lateral view as well. But again, let's identify that vessel. That's the anterior interventricular artery. And so what are we going to find on that side? Well, let's take a look. This is that anterior interventricular artery. And the chamber on this side of it, number 5, is the right ventricle. And when the ventricles contract, they're going to shoot blood out of their major arteries, and the vessel that the right ventricle sends its blood out to is this guy, which is the pulmonary trunk. And to do that, it has to go through that valve. What's the valve that separates the right ventricle from the pulmonary trunk? That's the pulmonary valve. So number 5 is the right ventricle. Number 6 is the pulmonary valve. Now what I want to do is to take a look at all of these major vessels that are coming off the top side of the heart, or the base of the heart. And let's start with number 7. Here's the right ventricle, and the right ventricle shoots blood into this vessel, number 7. And what is number 7? That's the pulmonary trunk. And what do trunks do? They branch. Like the trunk of a tree, the trunk eventually branches. And we have this branch, and then we have another branch that's going behind the aorta that you can't see. And what are these branches? Those are the pulmonary arteries. This is the left pulmonary artery, and over here is the right pulmonary artery. Okay, what about this vessel? That's the biggest, baddest vessel that's coming out of the heart. That is part of the aorta, and specifically, it's the ascending aorta. So you have the ascending aorta, then you have this section right here, which represents the aortic arc. And then below that, you have the descending aorta. Now there's 3 major vessels that branch off of the aortic arc. And let's start furthest away. Number 10 there, vessel number 10, what is that? That is the left subclavian artery. So it's going to serve the left side of the body, and subclavian means that it goes underneath the clavicle. So it's going to go underneath the clavicle, then eventually it's going to go underneath the armpit and become the axillary artery, and then it's going to run down your arm, become the brachial artery, and it's going to serve all of the tissues in the arm. Right next to that, let's do that in a different color. this vessel is the left common carotid artery. And that's going to go up through the neck, and it's going to serve the head. And then we have this guy. And this is the first major vessel that comes out of the aortic arc. And what is that? That is the brachiocephalic trunk. And again, what does a trunk do? It branches. And what I want to say is that on the left side, we have the left common carotid artery and we have the left subclavian artery. Well, we have those same vessels on the right side. And in fact, this vessel there is the right subclavian artery, and this vessel right there is the right common carotid artery. And so on the right side, you have the right subclavian that's going to serve the arm. You have the right common carotid that's going to serve the head. The only difference between the right and the left side is that on the right side, those vessels come out of the brachiocephalic trunk. Why it does that, I'm not sure. But on the left side, both of those vessels originate independently of each other from the aortic arc itself. Now we're looking at a torso model, and the heart has been removed. The heart would be located right there. Here we have the lungs. Yeah, but the heart has been removed. And so this represents the aorta coming out of the heart. And then you have the aortic arc that it's hard to see. And then the aorta points downward. And it moves downward through the thoracic cavity. It moves through the thoracic cavity. And as it does that, it's giving off vessels to serve the different tissues. And then it goes through the diaphragm. And it continues to descend, and again, it's giving off vessels, the renal arteries and whatnot, to serve the different organs and the different tissues. Now, when the aorta starts to descend, well, let me say this. This whole section of the aorta, all of this section of the aorta, where it's descending downward, is called the descending aorta. But we can divide those up into different sections. And specifically, the part of the descending aorta that goes through the thoracic cavity is called the thoracic aorta. And the part of the descending aorta that travels down the abdominal cavity is called the abdominal aorta. And then what happens is down near the pelvis, the abdominal aorta branches, and then you get these arteries. I think these are the common iliac arteries that go down and serve the hip and go down into the legs and serve the legs as well. Okay, now we're looking at a pig heart, and pig hearts are very similar to human hearts. And what we're looking at here is a pig heart in the anterior view. And what I want to know is what this vessel is right there. Well, we've talked about that one. That's the anterior interventricular artery. And then number 15, I want to know what this area of the heart is right there. And that is the apex of the heart. And that makes this area the base of the heart. Let's see, what are some other features? What's this thing right there? That is the left auricle. Okay, now we're looking at this pig heart in a frontal section. It's an anterior view, but a frontal section. So basically what we've done is taken this heart and split it into a frontal plane, and you can see where it's been cut here. And then what we're going to do is simply flip that part of the heart up, and this is what we're going to be left with there. This is a frontal section in an anterior view. And let's start off and identify number 16. What's that big chunk of muscle there? That is the interventricular septum. And what does the interventricular septum do? It divides the right ventricle from the left ventricle. Now let's take a closer look at the left side of the heart. And if this is all the left ventricle, then where do we find the left atrium? Well, that's the left atrium up there. And if you notice this thin, kind of flappy structure, that's a valve. And specifically, that is the left atrioventricular valve, or the bicuspid valve, also called the mitral valve. All right. So this is the left AV valve, and here we have these strings that are coming off that left AV valve, and that represents 17. What are those? Those are your heartstrings. Those are the chordae tendineae. And what do? Those chordae tendineae anchor the valve to papillary muscles. This big thing right there is a papillary muscle. And the chordae tendineae anchor the valve to the papillary muscles in the ventricles. And that prevents those valves from prolapsing back into the atria. It prevents blood from moving from the ventricles into the atria. Again, we have a frontal section anterior view of the heart. There's the interventricular septum. So now let's identify some heart chambers. Which heart chamber is that? That is the left atrium. Blood passes from the left atrium through the left atrioventricular valve and into number 19, which is the left ventricle. Now, when the ventricles contract during ventricular systole, the right ventricle sends blood out the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk, and the left ventricle sends blood out the aortic valve into the aorta. I'm going to go ahead and clear this. So during ventricular systole, the ventricles, including the left ventricle, contracts, and now we want to shoot this blood out through the aortic valve into the aorta. And what's going to happen is that blood is going to be pushed upward. And as it's pushed upward, this left AV valve is going to be snapped shut. It's going to move into the closed position. And these chordae tendineae are going to anchor it down and prevent it from prolapsing. And the snapping shut of that left AV valve and the right AV valve causes the lub sound. So if blood can't go up in this direction, where does it go? Where's the pathway out of here? And this is the pathway right there. And this thin flap-like tissue, number 20, represents the aortic valve. And what you'll notice about the aortic valve is that there are not any chordae tendineae. Okay, they're just these flasps. They're these cusps that are going to open in a one-way direction. So blood travels out through this aortic valve and into the aorta. And just as a way to remember this and a way to find this, I remember that when the ventricle contracts, that blood travels up right against the interventricular septum here. This is the pathway that blood is going to use to get out of the left ventricle. And if you identify the interventricular septum and move your way out, then you'll be able to find the aortic valve. Okay.